Thank you everyone for coming. I wish Elliot could have come to do this because he knows himself more than I do, that's for sure. And as most of you may know, he just turned 90 last month. And he's still working. And in fact, there are some photographs that he took in Cuba from 2015 and 2016 around the corner. He went to Cuba in the beginning in the 60s. I think it was for Newsweek magazine, and then he went back just recently. So make sure you look at those photographs. I will start out, his archive is at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin at the University of Texas campus. And he had a retrospective exhibition there about 2 years ago. And this is the book that came from that show. So if you're a big Erwitt enthusiast, I would highly recommend getting this book. And then there's others as well, like on the table, but not all of them are here because he published a lot. So I will start out with a quote from Elliot. He is a man of few words. He likes to talk, but he can say one-liners constantly. It's like he's got this great sense of humor. I take photographs for a living and also for my pleasure. Fundamentally, I'm a professional amateur. I like to travel to see the world and to check out the human condition. And that's pretty much in a nutshell about him. So in 1928 he was born, and he was born in Paris to Russian immigrant parents that eventually didn't really stay together. They divorced, whatever, but meanwhile when they were in France they moved to Italy, and then they moved back to France. Elliot learned several languages. He probably spoke Russian because that was his family's, his parents' language, and he learned French and learned Italian. And then they decided to move to the U.S. Well, it wasn't really decided, but they felt like for their safety they needed to move to the U.S. during World War II. So they ended up in New York. And then his father somewhat kidnapped him and moved him to Los Angeles. That's what the mother said. He basically kidnapped him. And he moved to Los Angeles, and there he went to school at Hollywood High School. And he got interested in film at this young age, and he also got his first camera when he was 14. So this is a young man who spoke several languages. He was actually, when he was in New York before he went to Los Angeles, he learned English very well, and he was doing very well in school. In fact, he skipped a grade. So he was really getting grounded in the United States. So when he was in Los Angeles, he picked up the camera, and I think he was very shy, and he wanted to communicate with his camera, basically. So at the age of 14, it all started. And then after high school, his father, I don't know if it was during high school or after high school, but his father, who was kind of, he wanted to travel, he wanted to go find something to do, but he ended up moving to New Orleans. And his mother still lived in Los Angeles, but meanwhile, Elliot actually stayed at the apartment that his father was paying for, and he lived by himself. And he was just a teenager, like 18 or so. And he went to classes at one of the local colleges and took some photography classes and learned like studio lighting and things like that. And he was actually compiling enough photographs to maybe put a show together. And so he went to New Orleans, and he had a small show somewhere in New Orleans. And then he went to New York. New York was really where he wanted to stay. He thought that that was home, and actually that is his home to this very day. He lives on the Upper West Side, facing Central Park. And that's where he keeps his studio, and he's been there for a long time. But when he ended up back in New York, he was very smart and very driven. And he introduced himself to Edward Steichen, who was then the curator at the Museum of Modern Art. He was the curator of photography. And Steichen actually bought some photographs of his, and he kind of gave him some names of people to contact. And these contacts they actually ended up giving him some jobs. And he also met Roy Stryker. Roy Stryker was the director of the Farm Security Administration, which that department was in charge of documenting how people lived, how people were living in the Great Depression era. Like the photographers like Dorothea Lange, who's being shredded and not a shredder, Ben Shahn and Walker Evans, that was like an incredible time in photography. Well, Roy Stryker met him, and he actually ended up working with him on a project soon after. And meanwhile, he was doing photographs of portraits of writers in New York, and he was doing his own private work. And like that image right there with the Chihuahua and the shoes, that was done early on in New York. And he used a Rolleiflex, and he would just be on the ground level and photographing from that perspective. And he was kind of invisible, and he liked that. And he really did well with the camera. And so then Roy Stryker, well, he was supposed to, he worked on a project in Pittsburgh, and it was for the Photographic Library of Pittsburgh. They wanted to document how the city was changing. And so he gathered some photographers and I can't remember all the photographers that were involved, but Elliott Erwitt was selected to be one of them. Meanwhile, Elliot was moving around constantly because he didn't want to be drafted for the Korean War. So eventually they got him in 1950, and he had to move from his job in Pittsburgh. And that photograph of the boy with the gun, that was shot in Pittsburgh. And just recently, about a year ago, a book was published on his Pittsburgh work. Anyway, so he gets drafted, and again, he has some really good contacts. Well, Edward Steichen, who was in the Army, he was an officer in the Army, he writes a letter, and he says, place this guy in as a photographer, I advise that he do photography in the Army. So he didn't have to go to Korea. He went to Europe. Very lucky guy. And while he was in Paris, and he won a prize while he was there through Life. They had like a young photographers contest, and he had won a prize, and that was enough money to buy a car. So he actually had a car, and he was driving around Europe while it was, in the Army. So he had a good deal, and he loved to travel. In fact, he had been to Europe earlier before this military draft. He had been there to Europe earlier and actually traveled with Robert Frank. Robert Frank is a very important photographer in history. He did the book The Americans, and he was friends with Robert's, and he would often stay in his apartment in New York or wherever. So they had a nice relationship, and there are some really nice photographs of him too. One of them is of he and his wife dancing in their kitchen, which is not in the show. So after the war, he actually finds this woman, they fall in love, and she gets pregnant, and so it's time for him to come back to the States, but they can't get her into the States, so she ends up in Bermuda. He goes to New York. He actually signs up with Magnum Photo Agency. Now, there's a little story behind that that I kind of skipped. In that he met Robert Capa in Paris, I think Paris, and showed him a portfolio. And he said, well, contact me again. And so Robert Capa, who was one of the founders of Magnum Photo Agency, along with Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was one of Erwitt's heroes, he signed up with Magnum when he got back from the war. There he was with Magnum. He had to get a job because he was about to have a family, and somehow he got himself to Bermuda to get his wife to New York, and because they gave him a job in Bermuda, and then he got back to New York, and there he was. He settled in New York. And does everybody know about Magnum Photo Agency? At the time it was called Magnum Photo Agency. I don't know what it's called. It's Magnum Agency or Magnum Photographs or something like that right now. But it's a major force in the history of photography. And they contracted with, several magazines at the time, like Ladies' Home Journal and Holiday, some other Life and Look magazine. When photography was important, he had all these great magazines to work for. So that's what he started to do. He started to do a lot of work with all these major magazines. And so you'll see in this show, there are actually photographs from jobs that he was doing, but there's a lot of work that he did for himself. And it's like in the quote I gave you. He does it for pleasure, he does it for work. So there's quite a mix in the show, and some of these images you'll really recognize. This image over here is actually of his wife and his first child and their cat. And that was actually part of the Family of Man exhibition that Edward Steichen put together. And this was a very important exhibition. It traveled all over the world. When it opened at MoMA in New York, it had the largest attendance of any show previously at that museum. It drew a huge amount of people. So it was a record-breaking show, traveled all over the world, and he had 4 photographs in the show. And there's a book of the show. It's if you're involved in photography, it's a book that everybody wants in their library. So he had 4 pictures in the show, and this one actually was used for a lot of the advertising. So you can see how meeting with Edward Steichen was a very important thing for him. Eventually, he had a one-person show, a solo show, and worked with John Sarkowski, the curator, after Edward Steichen. And that was later on in the, I don't know, I forgot when. Anyway, later on. The Magnum Photo Agency, founded by Cartier-Bresson, Robert Capa, I always think of them as like photojournalism, photographing in war situations, and it wasn't really like that. It was, commercial things as well. And of course, Cartier-Bresson was the person who coined the term decisive moment. And you can see in a lot of these images that Erwitt was very good with his Leica, which he finally got in Europe. He has this incredible way of seeing, capturing things at the right moment, and he's also very good at capturing humorous things at the right moments, as you can tell. So, one of the other photographs I wanted to talk about is Westinghouse had given him an assignment to go to Russia. In Russia, in Moscow, they had a special show And this was during the Cold War, and it was called the American National Exhibition. So they were losing the space race, but they wanted to win the consumerism race. So they set up these like kitchen models and things and refrigerators, everything that Americans were buying to live in suburbia and living a very middle class, very wonderful kind of lifestyle in the 50s. And he got into a certain place in the exhibition. In fact, it was a kitchen that he snuck into. And meanwhile, Khrushchev and Nixon, this is Nixon before he was president, somehow Nixon and Khrushchev were talking to each other. He swears that they were just talking about soup. But by the way that Richard Nixon is pointing at Khrushchev, it's like a very powerful moment. It's like, I'm putting you in your place and whatever. Eventually, Richard Nixon ran against JFK, and they used that image in Nixon's campaign, and they didn't get permission from Elliot. So that was quite interesting. And when he was in New York, he still had his interest in film, in, of course, cinema, not film photography. And he would go to see the films at MoMA, and he would go to see, he would go take classes at the New School in New York and learn a little more about cinema. And he was very influenced by the neo-realism movement in Italy. Well, that was a period of, these great movies like Vittorio De Sica, Fellini. All these films were done after the war, and they showed how poor things were, how devastated people were, and how they dealt with their lives. And you can see some influence in some of his images on, that neo-realism kind of movement. And it was mentioned in one of his books that there's this movie called Umberto D, and it's about this man that isn't doing well. He has this dog, and he ends up wanting to commit suicide. He wants to go in front of a train or something, but he has a dog in front of him, and somehow the dog saves his life. And so the writer says, well, I think this really hit him hard, and because he's always had this great affection for dogs throughout his life. And so I don't know if it was that film that really charged it, but he's been doing dog photographs before that. So as you can see, there's four really great images of his dog photographs on that wall behind you. So one of the great things about working for Magnum is that they would work with magazines with photographing movie stars, mainly going to movie sets, like The Misfits. There's a photograph out front with Clark Gable and all the actors that were in the movie, and the director John Huston and Marilyn Monroe. And actually, that film was the last one that Marilyn Monroe did, and Clark Gable. And there's a YouTube video online that you can find that he talks about that movie, that particular image that he took, but he talked about the filming and how difficult it was. And it's really quite good, but I thought about showing it today, but there's way too much to see already. So you can see that up front. And he also worked on the movie set of The 7-Year Itch, and there's a photograph of Marilyn Monroe with her skirt lighting up that he took. And on the waterfront, and Little Big Man. Well, they did some work from filming Dustin Hoffman on the set, but he wasn't part of the union. So people were not very happy with him doing film on the set. So he really couldn't do anything with his films. He dabbled in making movies, but nothing really happened from that. And then the terrible thing that happened in Dallas happened. Kennedy was assassinated, and Paris Match decided they wanted to document how we were doing in Texas, mainly Dallas, but what's going on in Texas after the JFK assassination. So Elliot gets the job, and he's sent out to Texas, and he travels around quite a bit. And there's actually one image, that tax collector that I assume he did that year. So he did that, and he actually traveled to Kilgore, Texas, and he wanted to come back to Kilgore because he saw like the rangerettes and things like that, and so he was kind of drawn to it. So as you will see the movie that he came back to do. He documented the rangerettes and the woman that ran the whole organization, who was absolutely amazing, and we'll get to see her. But a lot of the movies that he did were documentary style. And he also did some work for HBO, and I don't know if you all remember The Great Pleasure Hunt. It was kind of like, do you remember that show, The Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous? It was kind of like that. It was like they get to travel all over the world to film how decadent people can be. And he just, like they had a lot of fun with this, as you can imagine. So that was a very successful series, and he worked on a couple of other things for HBO. And really, those are I've kind of like quickly gotten you from photography into his film career, which is really, he's not famous for that, but it was a part of his life, very much so. And I think I've hit all the main parts, but I hope that if you have any questions about certain images, please ask me. There's an image of a family sitting on a sofa, which I really like, and he was working on some kind of advertising campaign for an insurance company. And so they showed this man who owned a flower shop and photographed him, but they don't really pay them. So he offered to do a family portrait of the family. So that is the family of the florist shop owner. And it's a really stunning image. I am very drawn to that for many reasons, but you have to see the expressions of the male's photograph as well as the female and the way she's sitting. And yeah, it's really good. And there's some really famous images of Fidel and Che in the other room, and you look at them and you go, I've seen these before. And this image down here, like I said, he photographed for himself. He also photographed for magazines, but this was actually some friends of his that he captured in that film, in that photograph. And this is one of his most famous images. We call that a signature image. He also had photographed nudes. He actually, in a very funny way, not in a studio situation, but in very funny circumstances, like at a nudist camp, or he photographed Mr. and Mrs. New America. And that was really hilarious. And I think he just likes the whole, humanity kind of, study. And then I like the photograph in Mexico of the mummies, and I don't know, some of you have maybe been there in Mexico, but the way that the man and woman are like standing there talking to each other amongst all these mummies is just, it's one of his greatest images. So anyway, that's Elliot.